The good news according to St. Mark, the 6th chapter. Glory to you. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go on ahead to the other side, to Bethsaida, while he dismissed the crowd. After saying farewell to them, he went up on the mountain to pray. When evening came, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land. When he saw that they were straining at the oars against an adverse wind, he came toward them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. When they had crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored the boat. When they got out of the boat, people at once recognized him and rushed about that whole region and began to bring the sick on mats to wherever they heard he was. And wherever he went, into villages or cities or farms, they laid the sick in the marketplace and begged him that they might touch even the fringe of his cloak. And all who touched it were healed. The good news of the Lord. Please be seated. I want to take a look this afternoon at that that gospel reading. And for a moment with your prayers, I want to talk about when God forces us into things. Now let me restate that. What God forces us into. In Nova Scotia, the Mi'kmaq First Nation, the indigenous people of the area, had a long-standing tradition. When a boy reached the age of 12 or 13, he had to go out into the wilderness and live there for a week by himself. It was a rite of passage from child to adulthood. Before he could consider marriage and a family, he had to prove he could survive in the forest, starting off with just a bow, some bread, and a mat. During that week away, he had to provide for and sustain himself. On the other side of the world, many of the Aboriginal communities of Australia send their boys into the wilderness for up to 6 months to test whether they are ready to become men. The boys must survive unassisted and keep themselves totally isolated. When they return after 6 months, they will be considered men of the tribe. These tests aren't meant to destroy the boys, but to build their confidence in their ability to manage the difficulties in life. Across time and around the world, people of many cultures have gone into the wilderness to mark life's transitions and seek guidance. In that time alone, they left the comfortable world they knew and crossed the threshold into the unknown. It was an initiation, a rite of passage, a new birth in the womb of the natural world. Sometimes God also commands us to leave our comfort zones and venture into the wilderness. Instead of protecting us from all of life's harms, God pushes us out the door to fend for ourselves. Instead of providing another job, God tells us to deal with it. Instead of delivering us from sickness, God commands us to be patient with it. Instead of saving us from difficult people, God allows us to be tested. Instead of providing a spouse or a child, God lets us figure out we have all we need. Instead of rescuing us from all of life's problems and difficulty, God often walks by us, forcing us out of the house to stay in the cold pain of life. I know I've probably shocked some of you with this. This isn't the typical image of God that's portrayed in today's Christian world. People don't want to hear about a non-anxious God. They don't want to hear about a God that's more concerned with your faith development than your physical or emotional comfort. not about a God that is willing to let you deal with the difficulties of life on your own, and definitely not about a God that sends you into the storm and is willing to leave you there. That isn't a popular God. To get an idea of the type of God Christians today like to hear about, all you have to do is watch the movie Facing the Giants. It's the story of a Christian football coach who was having a losing season. It was so bad, the season was so bad that the parents were turning on him and trying to get him fired. You know, that would never happen in Illinois. Along with the losing team, he was dealing with money problems. Plus, his wife couldn't get pregnant, and it was because of him. With his whole world going down the toilet, he decides to give God the honor in all that he did. And right after that, after he does that, things begin to change. The team turns around and he's given a large raise and a new truck. This was in Georgia, okay? They even win the state title against overwhelming odds. At the end of the movie, his wife finally gets pregnant. In other words, as soon as he gave God the glory, his whole life turned around. It's not a bad movie production-wise, but I still hated it. It portrays God as this benevolent Santa Claus. Just believe and you will receive. Most people like this God. They want this God. They like this comfort. They like this friend, but this isn't the God we serve. God doesn't always rescue the suffering and save the oppressed. Sometimes God allows us to live in doubt and uncertainty with no intention of helping us out. I'm not making this up. It's in our gospel text. That's the Markan account of Jesus walking on the water. Most folks think of the story in Matthew's gospel when we talk about Jesus walking on the water. We love to hear that story as a promise of God to help us in the storms of life. We love to know that Jesus came to the disciples and stilled the storm, even encouraging Peter to step out of the boat. But this version of the story isn't about the comfort that Jesus brings. The writer of Mark pictures this account as a rebuke of the disciples. For him, Jesus isn't the one who rescues us from our fears. Jesus is the cause of our fear. And Jesus is willing to allow us to remain afraid when the storms and sea rage around us. Jesus might just walk on by, not wanting to relieve us from our anxiety. I know some of y'all are probably completely shocked that I would suggest this. And honestly, in the many times I've read this text, I'd never realized that myself. This week as I read it, I realized there are three things that Jesus forces us into. First, we're forced into fear. This story begins where the feeding of the 5,000 ends. The disciples were there to witness this. After the people were fed, the disciples gathered 12 baskets of leftovers, enough to supply their needs. As this gospel writer does on numerous occasions, the next piece begins with immediately. The immediate thing that happens this time is Jesus makes his disciples get into a boat and cross the sea to Bethsaida. The term made could be better translated as forced or compelled. Jesus commanded his disciples to cross the sea alone at night. Now, this is a scary thought even for fishermen. It was one thing to go a little bit off the water to fish at night. Traveling 8 miles across the lake in the middle of the night was a different thing. The sea was the place of evil. The monsters were there. In the Hebrew scriptures, the water is the abode of all the forces that are against us. Traveling the lake at night was an intimidating experience, and Jesus sends his disciples into uncertainty. Jesus knows the journey will be difficult. The lake is a place of fear, and still, Jesus sends the disciples out alone to cross the lake. Sisters and brothers, sometimes God forces us out of the safe route into the dangerous one. We like the easy path. We enjoy the comfortable trail, but God commands us into uncertain territory. God forces us into talking about the Bible in front of mockers. God calls us to more than just baking casseroles, writing nice cards, and visiting the sick. God sends us out into the middle of the lake where there's real danger. We'd prefer to stay close to the shore and feel we were giving the Lord our best. We really like to do the easy work of the church and make excuses about the difficult task. But the same God that sent the disciples into the dangerous lake sends us out of our comfort zones. God forces us into fear. God also forces us into fright. There is a difference. The disciples are in the middle of the lake all alone while Jesus is on the mountain praying. Instead of rushing to rescue the disciples, Jesus is calmly praying by himself. My Bible says he's even watching them struggle and fight the waters. They are struggling against the wind, yet gaining no ground. They need help, and Jesus is just watching. There's no mad dash to save them and no immediate relief from their anxiety. If you've never been stuck on a body of water before, you don't know how helpless it feels. It happened to me once in elementary school when I was learning how to sail a catamaran with a friend. We traveled out onto Lake Erie highly confident in our abilities as sailors. We got what seemed like pretty far out on the lake when the wind picked up, blowing us further into the lake when we needed to head back to the shore. No amount of tacking or jibing could get us going the way we wanted to go. Thankfully, my friend's father was watching us from the shore and realized we were in trouble. He came out with his motorboat and towed us back to shore. Jesus was watching the disciples from the mountain, but he doesn't run out to them like my friend's dad did for us. He keeps watching from a distance to see how the disciples would react. Instead of saving the disciples from fright and fear, he plans on just walking to the other side and meeting them there. He has no intention of stopping to assist the disciple. It's in the Bible. Verse 48 says, he came towards them early in the morning, walking on the sea. He intended to pass them by. Jesus didn't plan to stop and relieve them of their anxiety. He told them he'd meet them on the other side, so he was just going to let them deal with the situation. I'm sure he knew they were afraid, but Jesus is just going to walk right by them. This isn't the Jesus that we like. We like the Jesus that's going to solve our problems. We like the Jesus that's going to take away our fears. We want the Jesus who's going to relieve us of our doubts. That's the Jesus the world wants. Just look at all the Christian books in stores. Even some of my colleagues write these books. There are titles of Out with Doubt, Without a Doubt, and No Doubt About It, all Christian books, okay? We want to eliminate any doubt in faith, any uncertainty and fear. We want Jesus to solve the problems and make the fear go away because fear is painful. In his book, Congregational Leadership in Anxious Times, Peter Stanke says, under pressure, people demand answers and assurances. Their expectation is that leaders will bring stability, provide safety, and offer quick solutions. There is the expectation that the leader will do all of this with a minimum of disruption and no surprises. In the same way, people want Jesus to deal with everything. Don't test me is the cry of the 21st century when God forces us into fright. Finally, God forces us into faith. Verse 49 says the disciples think they're seeing a ghost. They went from fear of the lake to being frightened of the supernatural. Jesus has compassion on them in their weakness and comes to them. In verse 50, Jesus says to them, "Take heart, it is I." Take heart can also be translated as have courage. That only loses part of the message. The second part completely misses the original point in the Greek. Where the NRSV says, "It is I," the Greek actually says, "I am." That's significant because that's what God tells Moses to call him in Exodus 3:14. So the text can better be translated as, "Have courage, I am." Now that should make somebody happy. Jesus is reminding the disciples that God is in their midst. They don't have to be fearful. They don't have to be frightened. God is with them. In fact, God's been with them the whole time. The author sums up the purpose of this story in verse 52 saying, "They did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened." They hadn't learned the lesson from the feeding of the 5,000. Now, you'll hear that text next week, but let me give you a little taste now. When you back up to verse 37 of chapter 6, Jesus says to the disciples about the hungry multitude, "You give them something to eat." Jesus tells the disciples to handle the problem of feeding all the people. They couldn't understand what Jesus was talking about because they were still thinking through the flesh and not the spirit. All they had to do was have faith that God would work it out with feeding the multitude. And all they had to have was faith that God would be with them in the middle of the lake. But they had missed the lesson on faith again. Most of us Christians see God as out there or beyond this world. When we consider all the violence, death, and destruction that occurs every day, we then pray for God to break into this world and deliver us. Here's the thing. The presence of the Lord is always around us. The same was true for the disciples. So they should have trusted in God's power. Jesus doesn't have to be in the boat because Jesus has the power to deliver no matter where we are. God's not out there. God is in us, around us, and working through us. In Acts 17, Paul says to the Athenians, "In God we live and move and have our being." With God always in us and around us, we have everything we need to make it through difficult times. We pray for God to alleviate our pain and suffering. Well, let me completely shake your world. Sometimes God lets us remain in pain and suffering. I didn't say God causes the pain and suffering. God lets us remain in pain and suffering. God lets us go through seasons of doubt. It's not to destroy us. It's to make us stronger because we grow in faith during the difficult times. There's a hint of truth behind the old saying, whatever doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Jesus knew that the faith of his disciples needed to be strengthened, and it couldn't happen without difficult times or without doubting. The writer of Proverbs 1:7 knew what he was talking about when he said, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge." Fear leads us into a deeper walk with God. So sometimes God has to stay on the mountain so people will develop a stronger faith. God forces us into fear. God forces us into fright. But it's also God can force us into faith. Let me conclude with this true story. Now I'm going to mess up his last name, and I practiced it a bunch of times, and now I'm going to mess it up. Nick Vujicic is a pastor who was born with no arms and no legs. All he has is a small foot attached to his body. If you've never heard him talk about his life and faith, find him on YouTube. He has a powerful testimony that will change how you think about your troubles and hardships. He shared before the story of how he learned to put his own clothes on. His mother had always done just about everything for him. She fed him, she dressed him, she fed him, she dressed him, and he'd gotten to be a big boy. One day she put his clothes in the middle of the floor and said, "Dress yourself." He looked at her in shock and said, "I can't dress myself. I don't have," but she cut him off and said, "You'll have to dress yourself." Then she left the room. Nick says, I kicked, I screamed, I yelled, "You don't love me anymore." Finally, I realized that if I wanted any clothes on, I'd have to do it myself. After what seemed like hours to him of struggling, he got his clothes on and was excited that he had done it all by himself. He then says, "It wasn't until later that I realized my mother was in the next room crying." It would be so easy for God to do everything for us, but we wouldn't really grow if God did. Sometimes we have to go through the trials and tribulations. Sometimes we have to go through the storms. Sometimes we have to go through fear and fright so that we can put our own faith on. Be assured that when it happens, God is in the next room crying for us. Amen.